Hello, everyone, and welcome to another Sporties webinar. We're very glad you could join us tonight. Tonight, we're going to be talking about a fast-changing topic, and that is the pilot hiring and job market and flight training and the overall career picture. My name is John Zimmerman. I'm with Sporties. I'll be your facilitator and host tonight. Thanks for joining us. I'm going to give you a couple of quick housekeeping notes and then turn it over to our presenter, who I will introduce here shortly. So first, you will notice this webinar is being recorded. So if you have to step away for a minute or if you miss something, don't worry. We'll have a video recording of this webinar up on the Sporties YouTube channel within about 24 hours. So you can check that out at YouTube and search for Sporties. Second of all, we invite your questions. Our presenter tonight's going to start out with some information, and we're going to have some back and forth between me and him, but then we do invite your questions. So you'll see in the GoToWebinar software panel, there's an option to ask a question. Feel free to throw those questions in at any time, and we're going to save some time at the end to make sure we answer some of those directly. Our presenter tonight, very pleased to have James Onieal with us. James knows an awful lot about aviation in general and careers in particular. He has been a professional pilot in almost every part of the industry. He's been a 121 airline pilot. He's flown fractional for a major fractional provider. He's been in the flight school part of the business. He's flown flight checks on FAA instrument approaches. So he's got just a really unique mix of experience in different parts of the industry. And these days he works for Raven Careers. He's the founder of it, which really helps pilots advance their career, whether it's that first step on the ladder or changing careers, stepping up that ladder. So he knows a lot, and I think he's also very honest and practical about the job market, and that's why we wanted to have him on tonight. So we're going to talk about where the job market is now. It was terrible, then it was great. Maybe now it's somewhere in between, and what you can do to put yourself in the best light. So James, I'll let you share your slides and take it away from here.
So as John said, my name is James. I'm the owner of Raven. We've been helping pilots for the past 15 years, from private pilot all the way up to ATP rated pilots, get hired by the first flight instruction job, get hired in the corporate space, get hired at the regionals, ultra low cost, all the way up to the legacies. And so depending on where you're at in your flying journey and how long you've been in the business, a lot of when we start talking to folks, we really start with strategy, and we really start with what's going on in the industry to help you chart your path. So what I'm going to do today is I'm going to share all the data that we've been pulling in over the past 15 years, and in particularly what's been going on in the past 6 to 9 months, so that no matter where you're at, whether you're that 250 to 500 hour pilot, you just got your CFI and you're trying to figure out, hey, what do I want to do next? Do I want to instruct? Do I want to try something like aerial survey? Maybe you're one of those folks that's at the 1,500 hour mark and you're struggling because you have, let's say, 1,000 hours of dual given, and you're trying to make that next jump into a turboprop or a jet, and you're having trouble getting that phone call. Or maybe you're someone that's been at a regional airline, or you're transitioning out of the military and you're trying to figure out, how do I get from where I'm at to a legacy airline? So regardless of where you fit, the information that we're going to talk today is going to kind of keep you in the loop on what's going on. So, all right. 2022 versus today, right? It's been a bit of a roller coaster. And so one of the things that we hear really, really frequently when we're on the phone with folks is a combination of frustration and confusion. And the frustration and confusion is not really directed at anyone in particular, but more, I've spent all the time, I've spent all the money, I'm doing everything I can to build the flight time, and they're just not moving at a rate that they expected to be moving at. And the reason is we've had a pretty dramatic shift in hiring going into COVID, right? So 2019 and 2020, we had a massive drop off in hiring that went basically almost to zero pilots getting hired, right? Now skyrocketing in 2022, 2023 to pilot hiring numbers, quite frankly, that had not been seen, right, since the first flight was taken in 1903. And then in the 2024 timeframe, we saw another pretty substantial drop off. It ended up being about a 60% drop in hiring that left everybody who came into the industry within the past, let's call it 5, 6, 7 years, really, really excited coming into COVID that their path to a legacy airline can happen in 3 to 5 years, to now, oh my God, I've got my CFI and I'm instructing, and I can't, it's 1,500 hours and I can't make that next big jump. And so what I want to do is spend a couple of seconds talking through kind of some historical hiring numbers so you can understand how the hiring waves normally work and where you are in that cycle. So if we go back to the year 2000, just prior to 9/11, and by the way, the numbers I'm about to share with you come from an organization, FAPA. They're a really great organization that provides data via their website, but they also do really, really great job fairs for folks as well. So FAPA, if you want to check them out, they're the ones that actually put together this data. But 2000, 2001, you were looking around 5,000 pilots hired per year. After 9/11, the terrorist attacks, we saw a 75% drop off in hiring. So we went from roughly about a 3,500 to 5,000 pilot number down to somewhere between 800 and 900 pilots hired. I started flying in 2000. I started college in 2001. Right after 9/11 was when I was personally coming into the industry trying to get my first job. And I remember, at the worst points, I had my CFI 300-400 hours total time. And when I was applying to flight schools, to be a CFI, you had to have a minimum of 1,000 hours time flying 121 in a regional jet to get a job as a flight instructor, right? So it was terrible at that period of time. Industry starts to recover in the year 2004. We start to see those numbers climb slowly from 900 all the way back up to 2,400, 2,500, almost hitting 3,000 until we hit the 2008 financial crisis. When we hit the 2008 financial crisis, it went almost to zero, right? We saw a 90-95% drop off in hiring. And unlike 9/11, where it took about 3 years for it to recover, right, those numbers stayed low until the 2013, 2014, 2015 timeframe before they fully recovered. So almost 5, 6, 7 years where folks couldn't really get a job. But once again, all the way up to 2019, when we're talking about a high year of pilot hiring, we're talking about 5,000 pilots per year. That was like a blockbuster year. Coming out of COVID-19 in 2022, the industry hired 13,000 pilots that year. In 2023, it was 12,000 pilots. So the level of hiring that we saw coming out of COVID was over double the highest hiring year we had seen in 40 or 50 years prior to that, right? So if you started flying in 2016, 2017, 2018, 2019, 2020, 2021, the expectation that was set for you was the hiring was super high. It was going to continue to be really, really high. We had unprecedented retirement numbers, and these retirement numbers are going to continue into 2030, 2035. And then all of a sudden, we run into some issues with Boeing. We run into some issues with Airbus, with aircraft deliverability and reliability issues. And then we run into some economic headwinds. And all of a sudden, right, we go from 12 to 13,000 pilots a year down to somewhere around that 5,000 pilot range. So it's tough because when you hear pilots who have been in the industry longer periods of time talk, they go, hey, this isn't that bad, because they're comparing it to 2008, right? But if you're new to the industry and your expectation was 12 or 13,000 pilots a year, then you're feeling a 60% drop in hiring, and that's catastrophic, right? Because the difference between what your expectation was in terms of how quickly you were going to be able to progress versus the reality was turning out to be very different. So rising tide raises all ships. Fast forward to about the last 2 or 3 months, and the hiring is starting to ramp back up again. And we're starting to see numbers of hiring well above that 6,000 pilots, 5,000 pilots per year mark. And when we take a look at hiring in the industry, whether you're going for your first low-time job, let's say as a CFI or aerial survey, let's say you're going to a regional airline or a smaller Part 135 or 91 operation, right? Or you're going to a larger 135 or 91 operation, all of the industry hiring is dictated by what happens at effectively 4 airlines: United, Delta, American, and Southwest, right? When United, Delta, American, and Southwest are hiring lots of pilots, you're getting attrition from the ultra low-cost carriers. You're getting attrition from the regionals. Flight instructors are quitting, right? As they're moving up the pile, going to the next highest job. right? So this upcoming year between United, Delta, American, and Southwest, we're looking at roughly a total of somewhere in the neighborhood of 6,000 pilots. Right now, it's looking like it's probably going to be somewhere around 600 for Southwest, probably somewhere around 1,500 for American, 1,500 for Delta, and probably somewhere around 2,400, 2,500 for United. Now, what's really interesting about this is when we take a look at the historical breakup of where those pilots come from, figure on average 25 to 30% of those 6,000 pilots are going to come from the United States military. The highest amount of those pilots will come from the Air Force, because that's kind of the largest branch of fixed-wing pilots. Next will be the Army, and then you'll have the Navy, and then the Marine Corps, and then the Coast Guard will kind of make up that 30%. So of 6,000 pilots being hired, figure roughly 1,800 of those are going to come from the United States military, spread across those branches. But that means roughly 4,200 pilots for the legacy airlines are going to come from places like an ultra-low-cost carrier, a large Part 135 like a FlexJet or a NetJets, a regional airline like an Envoy, a PSA, a Piedmont, a Commute Air, right? Or a smaller Part 135. Think about the ones that are kind of local to your neck of the woods. And as those legacy airlines start pulling those ultra low-cost pilots and those regional pilots, you're going to start seeing those CFIs start to get hired at their first jet job, which means if you're coming out of flight training and you're looking for that first flight instruction job, those are going to start becoming available. The difficulty is folks go, okay, that's great, but when is that going to happen? And so what we started to see at the legacy airline level was probably about 30 to 45 days ago, we started getting flooded with phone calls from people that are getting United interviews, American interviews, and Delta interviews. If anybody was following what's been going on with Southwest, they opened up their window and said it was going to be open for 2 weeks. 6 days in, they shut it down because they had too many applications, right? So the amount of people applying and the amount of people hungry for those jobs is really, really high, which means the competition at the legacy level is really, really high. But there's also a time delay. So when United, Delta, American, Southwest offer a pilot a job, it is roughly 60 to 90 days after that pilot is offered a job that they start taking a look at leaving wherever they're currently working and starting that class at a legacy carrier. So that means if somebody is offered a job at United, Delta, or American today, they're not going to quit their ultra low-cost carrier. They're not going to quit their regional airline. They're not going to quit a NetJets or a FlexJet until January of this upcoming year, which means, right, depending on how much those companies are coordinating with the majors, so think about a regional airline that's a subsidiary or a wholly owned or in close partnership with a legacy airline, they're going to have a lot of heads-up notice that that legacy airline is going to be pulling pilots from them. But if you're a NetJets or you're a FlexJet or you're a small Part 135 operator, you're only getting 2 weeks notice between when that job is a pilot is being offered a class date and they're letting a NetJets or a FlexJet or that small Part 135 know, hey, I'm going to be resigning. So that means there can be a further delay of 30 to 60 days after that, where a NetJets or a FlexJet or a small Part 135 operator begins the process of being able to interview and bring pilots online. So that was a really long way of saying it can be 3 to 6 months between when the wave starts reversing direction, which is happening now, and as you go further down this line towards the regionals and CFIs, that you're actually feeling it at your level and starting to feel those opportunities open. So when we take a look at where are you competitive, this is a chart that we use internally for the clients that we work with. My hope is it will be helpful to you. But we go all the way from the 250 to 300 hour total time mark up to 500 restricted ATP, 1500 hour ATP, and 2000 plus total time, right? So obviously at the 250 to 300 hour, we start taking a look at flight instruction, pipeline, aerial survey, tour operators. As we start getting above that 500 hour mark to the restricted ATP, we can start taking a look at smaller Part 135s. Think about places that operate Pilatuses. Think about places that operate King Air C90s, 200s, 350s, right? Operators like that, all the way up till we get to that restricted ATP, slash ATP, now you start looking in line for a place like a regional and ultra low cost carrier, right? And then obviously once we get above that 2,000 hour total time mark, depending on what your background is, military versus not, we can start taking a look at some of the legacy carriers. A couple of notes for the fractional ultra low cost. Obviously, Spirit is going through some difficulty right now. Axios put out a really good article this week. United Airlines is directly targeting Spirit by putting more aircraft on their routes. There's also been other articles coming up about how Spirit is in conversations with Frontier. This is a variable right now that nobody knows what's going to happen. If Spirit ends up going through a merger with a place like a Frontier, yes, it's probably going to slow down or stop hiring at a place like a Frontier, but congratulations, you don't have 2,500 to 3,000 pilots entering the street, flooding out looking for jobs that you're going to be competing with. Many of you may have seen Avelo put out a pretty good news release the other day. I think it's 50 firm orders for Embraer 195s that are coming online. So my point in saying that is at the ultra low cost level, you may start to see some fluctuations of what's going on, including a place like a Southwest is more of a low cost than an ultra low cost, but they're announcing that they're starting to look into starting up European operations. So while you may see some news out there that is a little bit scary, there's enough positive offsets that are going on right now that while, look, I don't think any of us would be excited to see a place like a Spirit furlough a lot of pilots, right? It's not like a 9/11 or a 2008 or a coronavirus where if those pilots were released onto the street, there are no jobs for them. Figure if Spirit were to lay off 2,500 pilots or 3,000 pilots, and let's say just between United, Delta, American, and Southwest, they're going to hire 6,000 that year. There would still be pilots above and beyond Spirit hired in that year that would be leaving regionals, ultra low cost, so on and so forth. So as I said, while some of the information may at times be a little bit scary right now, there's still enough positive things going on to offset any of that, that if you're aggressively networking and you're aggressively building your relationships, you will still end up with a good job. A lot of folks, when they come to us, whether they're somebody in their instrument training or their private training that's saying, hey, listen, I want to have a very smooth transition throughout my career where I want to be able to go straight into an instructing job, straight to a regional job, and then straight to a legacy airline, or hey, listen, I want to build my time instructing and then I want to go to a Part 135 and end up in a NetJets or a FlexJet, or hey, I want to do aerial surveys, skip flight instruction completely and end up at a Part 91 flight department. We take a look at what is the path to get you from where you're starting to where you want to go with the least amount of hiccups in between. And so this is a pretty straightforward, reliable path that you can start, no kidding, on day one in your private pilot training. If you follow this all the way through, you will end up with some really amazing interviews and opportunities at much lower flight times than what the rest of your buddies are hitting at. And the first step is actually on LinkedIn. Funny enough, the reason I am talking to you today is because John reached out to me on LinkedIn. And the amazing thing about social media like LinkedIn, which is really solely for professional networking, is you get direct access to the recruiter's pocket going straight to their phone. It's a really good opportunity to do what I call a cold approach, reach out to someone to get a conversation started. You can do that through a compliment. You can do it by sharing a post about a milestone that you hit, like getting your private pilot or getting your instrument or hitting 500 hours or 1,000 hours or 1,500 hours or finishing your ATP, CTP, or maybe there's somebody that you're mentoring that accomplishes something that's really interesting. But there's a lot of different ways to pop up on a recruiter's radar or pop up on another pilot's radar and start a conversation with them in a very non-threatening way where you're beginning the process of nurturing a relationship that can be shifted off of a social media platform and into a place like a job fair, a chief pilot meet and greet. I can't tell you how many people that we work with where we coordinate get-togethers over coffee with pilots in their local market. If you think about it, it's very intimidating to walk up to someone who has a lot more experience than you do that you don't know and interrupt their day and try and get them to talk to you. If you can use a tool like LinkedIn, you're removing the awkwardness of that cold approach of walking up to someone and going, "Hi, my name is James, will you please talk to me?" And now they've seen your picture, they know your background, right? You start a conversation, and now when you meet them at the local Starbucks, they know who you are, right? You have the ability to put a face to a name. You have the ability to ask for guidance. You have the ability to learn what it's like where they work. I can't tell you how many people will say, "I want to work at XYZ company," never having talked to someone that works there and never really knowing what is it like behind closed doors there. These opportunities to sit and talk with people, man, you'd be surprised how much information they share with you. What the pay rate is like, what the schedule is like, what the quality of life is like, what the type of flying is like, what's the culture like, what are the personalities like. All goes into this relationship nurturing and this trust and rapport. We tend to see job fairs and meet and greets tend to be the most effective way for 121 carriers and larger 135s. A lot of the smaller carriers, smaller 135s, just individual pilots at, let's say, a NetJets or a FlexJet or a United or a Delta American, that's where we tend to see those more in, let's say, coffee shop meetings. What you end up nurturing is an advocate, somebody that on the back end is willing to go harass human resources on your behalf to get you an interview. And that's the name of the game right now. It's too easy for you as someone off of the street, or sorry, it's too easy for a recruiter to just reject or ignore you as someone coming off of the street. But if they have a pilot that's internal, it's a lot more difficult for a recruiter to ignore them. So having an advocate behind closed doors that can send your resume in, that can write the letter of recommendation, that can call up a buddy is super, super effective, especially when you take a look at some of the more competitive jobs for the lower flight time. Let's consider sub 1,500 hours. A lot of those jobs are filled before they're ever posted online. I can't tell you how many times we have one client is leaving, let's say they're at an aerial survey company and they have an interview at a regional airline. We know they have a class date at that regional airline. They haven't necessarily told the aerial survey company they're going to quit yet, but we're able to connect them with other clients that we're working within our pipeline, and those clients are getting their information in front of the decision makers before anyone even knows the job's going to be vacant. So you can't underestimate the value of that networking, but it also drops the barriers to you getting a job in an interview, right? Think about an interview as really two things: demonstrating technical proficiency and demonstrating cultural fit. Well, if you have the ability to talk to people internal in that company before you ever walk in the door, they can start making that cultural fit assessment before you walk into that interview. If you have a good idea on what type of flying they're doing, what types of questions they ask about during technical interview prep, you're going into that interview way better prepared, and you're not starting on an even playing field with your competition. You're starting on second base. They're starting at home plate trying to swing at the ball. And the name of the game at the end of the day is to make the fight as unfair as we can in your advantage without cheating, lying, or doing anything unethical. Okay, so how do recruiters and chief pilots decide who they want to interview? Okay. So the first is that resume and that application come together, that when they are doing what they call a rack and stack, right? So you think you have, let's say 5, 7, 10,000 pilots have an application on file. They're going through that application and they're ranking where you stand in relation to all the other pilots. This is why when folks come with us, we fill the job applications out for them. Number one, how fully you fill out the application, how closely you follow the directions, making sure that your formatting is standard, making sure that there aren't spelling errors, making sure you're putting in information above and beyond the minimum of what the application is asking for so the recruiter can assess your competitiveness. Thinking, for us, for example, when we fill out an application for a client, let's say it's a 1,500-hour CFI going to their first regional job. Let's say it's a military pilot transitioning from helicopters into fixed wing. We've seen hundreds, thousands of resumes and applications of other people with your competitive set. We already know how you fit relative to them, and we know how the recruiter is looking at it, so we know how to highlight the experience to make you stand out. Once that's all put together, think about the next being kind of a visual scoring, right? So we all hear the saying, don't judge a book by its cover. Well, the reality is when you go to a job fair or a meet and greet or you network with somebody in a coffee shop, we're all judging books by their cover. So how you dress, right? Does this require something formal like a suit? Is this something where you want to dress business casual? Is it something where jeans and a t-shirt are the way to do it? And I know this may sound crazy, but if you're doing a networking event at a local EAA chapter or something like that, showing up in a suit's probably not going to be appropriate. So you want to be dressed for the environment that you're going to be meeting the person in. But also, if it's an environment where they're going to be looking at a logbook or they're going to be looking at a resume, making sure that the resume or the logbook is clean, that it's laid out, that you know where all your errors are, that you have explanations for any of the errors, and that everything you're presenting them is laid out in the order that they need to make their life easy. That's the key to making yourself stand out in a positive way. And then lastly is kind of your verbal presentation, right? When you give an introduction, does it sound like it's scripted, or does it sound like you're actually talking to them like a normal human being, right? When you're talking about why do you want to work there, have you been doing your networking and you've been talking to lots of pilots there so you actually understand what the company is like and what the job is going to be like, and so you can speak intelligently? Or are you making up generic stuff like you have a great culture and a great safety system in place, right? If you have any background issues, we work with a lot of people that have check ride failures and terminations and DUIs and arrests, right? Pilots are human beings, man. They make mistakes. And those mistakes are overcomable, but they have to be addressed properly. And knowing where is that going to pop up in an interview? Is this going to show up in an introduction? Is it going to show up in a tell me about a time story? Is it going to show up when the recruiter asks me a question? Or in our case, where we actually write the explanation for you in the application, I can't tell you how many times folks will go into an interview and the recruiter will go, we don't have any additional questions, the write-up covered it for us. You can do these things in a way where you are proactive instead of reactive, where the interview is a conversation instead of an inquisition, and lower those barriers so that when they're making a decision on are you worth the investment of bringing into an interview, that when you get to that interview, you're worth the investment to offer a job. Okay, here are some of the common questions that we get asked for folks. By the way, if you guys have any questions based on what we've been talking about so far, please feel free to put them into the chat as John will be sifting through them and then asking. Okay, so one of the big things we get from folks is, hey, look, I've been networking, it's not working, what should I do? One of the biggest issues that folks run into when it comes to networking is they behave transactionally, not relationally, right? So when they reach out to someone, it is with the energy of, what can you do for me? Can you help me get a job? Can you walk my stuff in? They skip the trust and rapport building process. They skip the process of getting to know the person. They skip the process of getting a conversation started, and they shift straight into, what can you do for me? And that is typically where we see the networking failing, which is why when we work with folks, we spend so much time one-on-one with them, coaching them through how do you actually get a conversation started? What types of questions are appropriate to ask? What types of questions are not appropriate to ask? For example, the difference between can you help me get a job and how do you like flying there, right? What has working there been like? Questions about them that get them talking, that set a foundation of information that you can build off of to continue into deeper levels of conversation and kind of guide from there. When we take a look at what is the best type of time to get to make you stand out, this varies a lot depending on where you're at in your career. So for example, if you are a lower time pilot, let's say sub 200, between 250 hours and 1500 hours, right? We start taking a look at things like cross-country time. We start taking a look at things like operating in and out of Class B airspace. We start taking a look at things at how much actual IFR flying time do you have. We start taking a look at, do you have 25 to 50 hours of multi-time, right? Those are a little bit more simple. that's mostly where do you fit compared to what the ATP minimums are, and how much practical real-world flying experience do you have? As we get above that 1,500 hours, now we start taking a look at, okay, can we get you into something turbine, right? Can we get you into a Pilatus? Can we get you into a King Air? Can we get you into a regional jet? Because now you need to start stretching your wings into real world departure procedures, arrival procedures, hard IFR flying, operating in out of controlled airports and uncontrolled airports, getting experience operating in a crew environment, right? Whether it's flying passengers or flying cargo. And then as we continue above that 2,000 to 3,000 hour mark, then we start taking a look at time as PIC, right? Captain time, but also time working your way into, you know, a lot of folks look at the straightforward things like, let's say, a check airman or a chief pilot or a director of operations, right? But there aren't a lot of those jobs out there. So we start taking a look at, okay, hey, if you can't get one of those directly, how do we start taking a look at what type of volunteer experience do you have, right? Where you can start working with folks outside the cockpit to build some of that leadership and problem solving and decision making. Which leads into, if not hours, how can I make myself more competitive? What does that mean and why should I? When you think about making yourself competitive, right? So for example, if you're looking for your first jet job or your first turbine job, a lot of that boils down to how much of an asset are you in the right seat? And when we think about those things, that's basic IFR flying skills, but it's also people skills. The big shift when you get into airline flying, corporate flying, so on and so forth, a majority of the problems you're going to run into are not airplane related, they're people related. And so how do you work with a crew? How do you de-escalate conflict? How do you get into anticipatory customer service? Those are the things, the soft skills are really what make you more competitive and more of an asset. And then as you continue through your career, right, as you start getting up to the ultra low cost and legacy level, they just really dial down more into that kind of on those leadership and communication skills. In terms of ATP, CTP, do you need to get that completed on your own? Yes, right now you do. If you were a 1,500-hour pilot and you were either going corporate or you were going airline, the days of them paying for ATP, CTP are behind us. Will that pop up in the future? I don't know, but I'm expecting for a minimum of the next 12 months that you're going to have to pay for that ATP, CTP out of pocket. We recommend Shepherd Air to study for the test. And then in terms of where you want to go get your ATP, CTP, think about wherever is closest to you to take the course, as well as what is most cost effective. Some are cheaper than others. At the end of the day, ATP, CTP is really about getting the sign off to take the written test, less about how much do you really learn. I know that may not be a popular opinion that I'm supposed to say out loud, but at the end of the day, it's really about getting a sign off to take the written test. How many check ride failures or items in your background can you have in today's hiring environment? Okay, so we get this question a lot. We run into folks with check ride failures. So check ride failures are about trends, right? So if you fail your private and your instrument and your commercial and your CFI and your double I and your MEI, I have a trend. You keep failing check rides, right? If you pass your private, but you fail your instrument, you pass your commercial, you pass your CFI, but you fail your double I have a trend, right? You have trouble on instrument training. So think about check ride failures not so much as the maximum quantity of check ride failures, but think about the trend. Believe it or not, we just got someone hired here, I think it was about 3 or 4 months ago. I think it was 9 check ride failures they had, right? So do I advocate going out and getting that many check ride failures? Absolutely not. They got their first turbine job at actually a pretty well-known Part 91 flight department. The key behind check ride failures is, number one, when we, at least when we write the explanation, we want it to be short, we want it to be succinct, and when the recruiter reads it, we want them to go, okay, this person is shooting straight with me, there's no BS here, right? Number two, when you provide that write-up, it needs to not only explain why did you fail the check ride, but it needs to explain what you learned from it and why that's not going to happen again. At the end of the day, it's not so much failing a check ride being a bad thing as much as it is a liability of, if I'm going to put you into a $20, $30, $40, $50,000 training program, are you going to pass the training? And so when I say to people, someone with 9 check ride failures, are like, oh man, how did they get hired? Because we were able to explain it in a very truthful, in a very honest way. We did a lot of networking with the individual before they went into the interview, so the recruiters were aware of what the person's background was before they went into that interview. And we were able to not only explain why they failed the check ride, but they were able to almost talk the recruiter through and teach them how to not run into that scenario again. So by the time the interview was over, the interviewer was clear on what caused the failure, clear that the person learned what they needed to not repeat the failure again, and then was able to make a decision to offer them a job because they did not look at them as a liability. Okay, I'm going to turn it over to John here in a little bit. For any of the questions that were placed in the chat, thank you very much. I understand some of you may have specific unique background issues or specific questions that you're not comfortable asking publicly. You're more than welcome to go to ravencareers.com. You can click on the contact us and you can actually schedule a free 15-minute strategy session with us. You'll either get with me or Eileen on my team to have a conversation about what's going on. So if you're comfortable asking your question in the chat, thank you very much. If you're not, once again, you can go to ravencareers.com, click on the contact us, and we'd be more than happy to have a one-on-one conversation with you privately. On that note, John, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Yeah, James, great advice. So many winners in there. That's gold, which you shared. So you hit a lot of the most popular questions. Here's one though that I get a fair amount at Sporties, and I'm interested in your answer, which is the more mid-career change. I'm not 19 pursuing an airline job. I'm 40 and I've decided I don't want to be an accountant or a dentist or whatever it is, and I want to be an airline pilot. What is your advice for that person switching jobs? Is it, number one, is it crazy? Can they do it? Should I pursue my ATP at age 40? And if I do decide to do it, what are some tips to do that the right way and make myself an attractive candidate?
Sure. So we actually have a lot of clients that fit that profile. And so let's go through a couple of the difficulties that they run into. So it's a little bit different if you're a career transition at, let's say, 35 versus 45 versus 55. So the first is we have to figure out how many years do you have left in the industry, right? So if you are 35 years old and you want to fly for a 121 carrier, you have 30 years left in that industry. But if you're 55 and you go 121, you only got 10. But if you go to a FlexJet or or other 135s, you can have all the way up to 70, above 70, right? So the first we need to figure out is, what is your desired end goal? Do you care if you go airline versus not airline? Because it's going to shape how fast we have to make that transition. The next thing that we go through is, typically with us, not 100% of the time, but a lot of the time, when we have folks that are career transitions, they have a spouse, a husband or a wife, right? They have children involved, right? They have people they are responsible to other than themselves. When I entered flight training, it was easy. I was 18 years old. I had no responsibility. I could spend 30 hours a day, 9 days a week, right? Focused on flight training. But if you have a child, right, or if you have a spouse, a husband or wife that has their own job, right? There's other things in there or other life factors in there that we need to account for when we plan out what is that transition going to look like. The reason why that's so important is a lot of the conventional advice that people get is do it as fast as you can, seniority is everything. And that is a vast oversimplification that's not very accurate. And so it's very easy to turn to someone in their early 20s and say, hey, run at this full speed. But the reality is, let's say you're making $100,000 a year or $200,000 a year. And you're now going, okay, I'm going to go back and go be a CFI for $30,000 a year and work my way up to 90 grand a year at a regional airline and then eventually get to a NetJets or a FlexJet and go to 130, 180, 200, 250, right? Like, that's a huge pay difference. So we start looking at things, do they dry lease airplanes? Do they purchase an airplane so that they can time build and flight instruct and not quit their day job right now, right? When we run the financial numbers with them and their family, and usually what we do is we do this one-on-one, and it's me, them, and their husband or wife, pen to paper, calendars out, writing out the transition schedule, a lot of it is how do we preserve your income and your quality of life as long as we can. Yes, it might slow down your transition into the cockpit a little bit, but it's going to be infinitely less painful than doing it quickly. And so a lot of what it boils down to with career transitions, and we have folks honestly in their 50s doing career transitions, right? So, you know, in terms of is it too late? Usually the answer is no, but it does. Like if you want to be a wide body international captain, there's a point where it's too late, right? But a lot of it is how do you, before you go down that path of dumping boatloads of money into flight training or quitting your job to become a CFI, is let's write a timeline out and let's pen to paper with the numbers and let's plan this out so the sacrifice is intentional and it's not arbitrary.
Great tips, and that is definitely a booming part of the market. Here's another one I get all the time, asked by a listener here. Is 141 training better or more sought after than 61 training? And I guess just in general, does it matter what flight school I go to?
It's a great question. So if you own a flight school, and it's particularly a 141, you will have your answers as to why it is better. If you own a Part 61 flight school, you will have your answers to why that's better. I actually don't believe that. I did my training Part 61 and Part 141. It boils down to what your learning style is. So I'm in my 40s now. I understand my learning style. I understand my studying style, right? I could go to a good Part 61 flight school, and as long as I have a reliable instructor, right? So for example, when I did my private, I had 8 flight instructors in 9 months. Not the way to do that, by the way.
Wow.
But you know, as long as I know I can get the same flight instructor all the way through, and that flight instructor is willing to tell me I need you to read these pages before you show up to the lesson. If you're good at self-study, you're good at keeping yourself motivated, Part 61 is great. If you're someone that needs structure, if you need a hard lesson plan on what's going to happen next, Part 141 will be a better deal for you. So the first is you got to take a look at your learning style. And this is something that we do with folks. A lot of the things, or a lot of the reasons that we see for check ride failures with folks in primary flight training is they pick the wrong type of flight school for their learning style. The second aspect of it is, does that 141 flight school allow you to get ratings at lower flight times? Right? And so different flight schools have internal self-designating authorities, so you don't have to wait for DEs as long. And they have reduced minimums for certain certificates and ratings. And so if you're looking for an accelerated path, there are certain 141 programs that can allow you to accelerate faster than Part 61 would. So those are usually the variables that I think of when I think about 61 and 141.
Yeah, that's great advice. I think we at Sporties have a flight school, very active flight school. We do both 141 and 61, and there's just not a one-size-fits-all answer. It depends, as you said, who you are, your learning style, what your goals are. Here's a...
Just real quick on that, by the way. Interview the flight school, like interview multiple of them. So we do a lot of strategy sessions. This is usually with younger folks, but honestly, we do it with some mid-career change folks as well, where we will sit down with their parents in a session with the actual individual and go, okay, here are the questions to ask before you walk into the flight school. Same thing, career changers, because they have some different variables in terms of their scheduling. Here's a different set of questions based on your specific situation. And I always tell people to go talk to 3 flight schools and make sure at least one of them is 61 and one of them is 141. But interview the flight school before you go. And get on LinkedIn and network with students there as well. Ask them privately. So.
Yeah, another great tip. It's amazing how few people do that. You're going to spend tens of thousands of dollars potentially with this flight school, and people sometimes shop for it less than they would a brand new cell phone. So 100% agree on that. Let's talk a little bit more about kind of corporate or fractional versus the airline world, because a lot of hiring advice out there is about the airline track, the 121 world.
Sure.
If I think I might be more interested in the corporate world or the fractional world, A, what are some of the pros and cons of that lifestyle? And B, is there anything I need to do differently to set myself up for that career versus that airline track?
Yeah, so I had an opportunity to do airline and fractional. So I worked for 2 different regionals, and then I was actually the assistant POI for Atlas and JetBlue in the New York FISDO. So that's kind of my airline background, and then I had an opportunity to fly for NetJets. So The flying's completely different. I mean, they're not even on the same planet. For my buddies that are very routine driven, man, do they love the airlines. I have a buddy of mine that's very senior at United. He is a first officer. He's a 737 first officer based out of New York. He could be a 767 captain. But he really likes going to about 3 destinations and flying with the same 7 guys all the time, right? And you can do that at an airline, right? He bids the type of flying that he wants. He has a set schedule. If I call him up and go, hey man, in January you want to go on vacation someplace, he'll go give me the days and he can bid them off. He knows exactly what time he's going to start in the day, exactly what time he's going to end in the day. The routes are all the same. So if you are a routine-oriented person, the airlines are great. Just understand you're working in a big system, right? So you have a lot of cooks in the kitchen. And as the airlines have progressed through the years, they have taken a lot of the responsibility off of the shoulders of the pilot. In one sense, it's a good thing. It dramatically lowers your stress. But in the other sense, there's a lot of areas with the client customer experience you can't impact, right? You're just a pilot. When you take a look at a fractional operator or Part 91 flying, right? You have a lot more impact over the client experience. You are directly interacting with the folks in the back of the airplane. You are directly involved in the problem solving. Your routes are constantly changing. You have the opportunities to do domestic flying and international flying. But when you wake up in the morning and you take a look at your schedule, that doesn't mean anything. It's basically written in Etch-a-Sketch. It's going to get shaken up and changed up 3 or 4 times a day. So if you are somebody that gets bored easily, if you are someone that likes novelty, if you are someone that thrives in constant change, that's where I start taking a look at fractionals. If you are someone that's a soft skills oriented person, right? If you really get a kick out of figuring out what somebody wants or needs before they have to say it out loud, you're going to enjoy fractionals or Part 91. And airlines will drive you crazy. In terms of safety, they're equivalent, right? Like you take a NetJets or a FlexJet, a United, a Delta, even PSA, Piedmont, Envoy, they're effectively operating at an equivalent level of safety. How many resources they have is going to be a little bit different. American Airlines is going to have more resources than Piedmont, right? NetJets pilots are going to have significantly more resources than a smaller Part 135. But when you get to that level, legacy airline, NetJets, FlexJet, you have an equivalent level of safety. NetJets is a 121 certified training program. The guys from US Airways, when they did the merger, were the ones that came into NetJets and designed the training program. They use something called an advanced qualification program, AQP. So in terms of that, it's equivalent. It's really what lifestyle do you want to have? So hopefully that answers that.
Yeah, and how do I track the job market there? Because the numbers you quoted at the beginning from FAPA, which is a great source, but those are really just airline numbers, right? So if I'm interested in what's the market like at FlexJet or NetJets or 135 operators, is there any data out there on that, or is it mostly just word of mouth?
It's a little bit tougher, and it's a little bit tougher for a couple of different reasons. So, we saw a massive shift in pilot hiring at FlexJet and NetJets over the past year or two because their attrition dropped. When United, Delta, and American are not hiring as many pilots, guess what? Not as many are quitting from NetJets or FlexJet. Because they don't have a 65, NetJets does have a mandatory retirement age at 70, but because their retirement ages are a little bit different than the airlines, you can't necessarily predict how many people are going to retire off the seniority list. Not everyone's going to make it to age 70, either because they don't want to or they can't, right? And then the other variable is their aircraft deliverability issues, right? So there's been some issues with Textron delivering aircraft this year. And I think actually last year as well. So it's a little trickier to track those numbers just because there's more, they're not publicly traded companies, right? So they're a lot quieter about what's going on. You take a look at NetJets and it fits under Berkshire Hathaway with, flight safety and a couple of other things, right? So it's a little harder to track those numbers are a little bit quieter, if that makes sense.
Here's a question from a attendee here that I have not thought of or heard, so I'm interested in your opinion. and I'll quote it here, what, if any, opportunities are available for part-time flying? For example, teaching during the academic year and flying during the summer months.
So when we take a look at that type of work, historically what we will see is someone will go into a larger company, right? They'll go into either a regional airline or they'll go into a legacy airline and get into the training department. And when you'd think everybody wants to be in the training department, a lot of people don't like training. And so what they'll do is they'll work as a sim instructor or a ground instructor, and they might fly 3 or 4 days a month. And the rest of it is in the schoolhouse. Now, if you think about it, amazing quality of life. You're home every night, right? If you have a husband, wife, or children, they don't even realize you're employed at that point. You basically get to pick who you're going to go fly with when you go fly, so there's no more bad trips. And so it's kind of one of those best kept secrets that if you like teaching, amazing quality of life, amazing opportunity. In terms of outside of that structure part-time flying, that's a lot more difficult. You start looking at contract flying at that point is really where you start getting into more of the part-time, or you're heavily networking into somebody locally that like owns a Cessna 421 or a Pilatus or a King Air as part of their business, and they only fly 30 hours a year, 50 hours a year, something like that. That's usually retirement gigs though. So
fair enough.
Yeah.
So we're running out of time. I encourage folks, if you got one last question, throw it in there. Here's one that I want to pose to you, James, because you have unique perspective on this. What do you see if you're talking to a brand new pilot who's maybe they're through their private, but they're really not that far along and they're thinking about a career? What is the number one mistake or advice you'd like to give them that can save them some heartache down the road?
It's focusing on speed versus focusing on quality. And I'll give you a great example. When I got hired at my first airline, I mean, I didn't have Guinness come out and check, but I'm pretty confident I was the world's worst instrument pilot. I was horrific. Instrument training was very difficult for me. It was all steam gauge cockpits at that point, so there were no iPads, there were no, I think it was a KLN 89B or something. It wasn't even color. It was like a dot matrix GPS. And so I couldn't create a picture in my head of where I was in space. So I kind of memorized how to do all the local approaches, and then I did a rain dance before my check ride and I passed. But after that, I got my CFII, and then I basically refused to take on instrument students because I was horrible at it. And so I spent the rest of my time, at that point it was 1,000 hours to get hired by an airline and 100 hours multi-time, and I really stayed solely in the VFR space. But the difficulty is when you go out into turbine flying, it's all IFR, even if it's VFR outside. And so getting that diversification of experience, getting real world cross country time. When I talk to folks time building, go to a Class C airport, go to a Class B airport, right? Go out in what I call gentleman's IFR, 1,500 foot, 1,000 foot ceilings. You don't have to go in 200 foot, but at least for the cross country phase, get yourself into the clouds. Start focusing on developing the skill set, not just getting there as quickly as possible. Otherwise, you'll be like me in a turboprop, flying in and out of Boston, and ATC basically went, proceed, direct this fixed clear for blah, blah, blah approach. And I turned to the captain, I went, are we allowed to descend? And he turned to me and went, you really need to get back into the books. And he wasn't wrong. But I didn't know. ATC gave me a clearance and I didn't know what I was able to do. You can get there if you don't diversify your experience.
All right, one last question and then we'll wrap up. And this is a good one because I've heard different advice on this. There's I think some myths floating around there. But does the reputation of the flight school I'm learning at matter, or the reputation of the flight school I instruct at matter? We talked about 61 versus 141. Let's leave that aside. Does it matter if I'm at a big name flight school or a local one that's closer to my home?
No. Unless the flight school is in the news for doing something blatantly illegal or unsafe. What is more important is what types of students are you teaching. So Once again, for me, I stuck with VFR students, so I didn't have enough diversification in my teaching, number one. One area where I did something inadvertently smart was I specialized in students that were struggling to pass check rides. So anytime the CFI had someone that they couldn't get across the finish line, they went to me. So it's less about the name brand of the flight school, and it's more about the quality of the student and the type of instruction that you're doing. If you have the ability to do a nice mixture of VFR and IFR teaching, I would recommend that. It will make you a much better, well-rounded pilot than I was speaking, honestly.
Great. Well, James, thank you so much for the insight tonight, the advice, the tips, the real-world experience you've shared. I want to leave listeners tonight with 3 resources I think that can be very helpful as they navigate their journey. First, ravencareers.com, James Onieal's website. Lots of great resources there. Also a great way to get in touch with James if you want to learn more. Second, again, the Sporty's YouTube channel. You can get a recording of this webinar there and lots of other videos on lots of topics, including careers and flight training. And then third, flighttrainingcentral.com. This is a free website that Sporty's does, all about learning to fly, building time, chasing a career. James has written for that site and will continue to, so if you want to read more of his advice, I encourage you to check out flighttrainingcentral.com and subscribe to that email newsletter. With that, we're going to wrap up. Thank you very much for attending tonight's webinar. We hope to see you again on a future Sporty's webinar. And in the meantime, please fly safely.